An hour ago, an unexpected turning point. Fedorov tightened the noose around Moscow's neck, a statement that sounded like a verdict for the Kremlin. This is a real turning point in the war. Putin was shaken when he found out. At that very moment, the dictator decided to turn his troops and head for the Baltics. Europe is preparing for the worst. The armed forces of Ukraine warn the audacity of Putin's soldiers. It can be broken. Ours managed to do it. Gerasimov came up short by an entire battalion near Lyman. The front is crushing the occupiers from all sides. The Z military correspondents no longer believe in the so-called special military operation and are begging for an exit from the war. Kremlin offices are burning. Trump is pulling Lukashenko out of Putin's shackles. A blow to the gut. Is this really the beginning of the Minsk Revolution? Russia is breathing its last. Poverty is officially kicking down the door in Moscow. All this in our episode of Hellpoint. A historic moment. Ukraine is winning, and the name of Mikhailo Fedorov has become a curse for the Kremlin. Wherever he appears, catastrophe begins in the Russian Federation. He made powerful statements to Putin's face without any diplomatic euphemisms. 50,000 Russian soldiers are under the close watch of the IAEA. Moscow is experiencing a real nervous breakdown. Starlinks are disconnected, and Shaheds are returning to Russian territory. And over Ukraine, an Iron Dome is being erected. What other striking force has Fedorov kept in reserve for the enemy? Let's watch for dessert. Ukraine's new Minister of Defense, Fedorov, has only been in office for 3 months, but he has already managed to implement several shocking reforms that have sent the enemy into a real frenzy.
The president set a clear task: to build a system capable of stopping the enemy in the sky and halting their advance on the ground. To strengthen asymmetric strikes against the enemy and its economy. To make the cost of war for Russia so high that it simply cannot afford it. Stop the enemy by force.
The new minister is not afraid of change and has been actively introducing technology into the army since his time at the Ministry of Digital Affairs.
We began to systematically seek asymmetric solutions where conventional warfare was too expensive or impossible for us. FPV drones. Instead of ATGMs to destroy armored vehicles, drones copters instead of scarce ammunition and artillery, Ukrainian Lancets instead of HIMARS, interceptors as part of the air defense system.
The first and most important thing is the statement by the new minister that it is necessary to increase Russian losses to 50,000 soldiers per month.
Yes, indeed, Fedorov has the ability to create such conditions that the Russian army will start losing more people than it receives every month. That is, right now Russia is receiving about 30,000, and if it loses 50,000, then of course this creates a serious problem for Russia. And overall, from their point of view, this could put Russia on a track that leads to complete defeat in the war.
The propagandists have started having nervous convulsions because they also understand that such a goal is entirely achievable. And very soon...
Indeed, a competent organizer of drone production. And now he has set the task to increase the losses. The military strength of the Russian Federation is up to 50,000 per month, well, thanks to drones. And in general, I believe this is a rather serious enemy, formidable. They
especially emphasized, as I said, that Fedorov was born in 1992, so he is 34 years old, and from the point of view of these war correspondents, this creates very big problems for the Russian military command, for the Russian army, because the Russian command and the Russian army are still living in the Soviet era. From their point of view, Fedorov is a very competent organizer and manager. And in general, it's hard to disagree with that. Indeed, those people who know him in Ukraine give him the same high assessment.
Another challenge that the new Minister of Defense managed to solve was finally blocking the Russians from Starlink and provoking yet another round of hysteria among Putin's lackeys.
We need those Starlinks to work there because certain technologies are being used that are important for us as well. They are connected to UAVs. There's another way to ensure that our Starlinks work, while the Starlinks that essentially appear there by other means do not work. And so we are working with SpaceX to resolve this issue.
I would also like to draw your attention to the immense love between Elon Musk and the scoundrel murderer, thief and Russophobe, the current Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Fedorov, who apparently calls for the killing of 50,000 Russians. And Musk is ready to provide him with all-out support by blocking certain capabilities for which, I remind you, he receives money. And there should be no illusions about this. There is no such thing as Starlink being an independent company.
In addition, at his first Ramstein meeting, Fedorov managed to secure a record amount of support from partners for the necessary weaponry.
Today we heard announcements totaling almost $38 billion. And a large part of these announcements were new today. They are allocated specifically for air defense systems, for drones, for the development of drone assault units, for deep strike, and for interceptor drones.
The new Minister of Defense also visits the front lines and is preparing a reform of the Ukrainian army to make justice the main value and to attract more volunteers.
Just yesterday morning returned from a trip to the front. We met with up to 10 commanders of corps and brigades in various groups. Among other things, I asked many questions about our vision, about how we will address this issue, how we propose to solve it. Our task is to get feedback from the military, those who work with the SZZ, where the SZZ takes place, those who return the SZZ, those who work with the mobilized, to understand their feedback.
Putin and his inner circle still dream that one day loyal people will come to power in Ukraine and agree to all their demands. But instead, with every new appointment, things will only get worse for the Russian criminal army.
This is just the beginning, the first explosions in the Baltics. Putin took the scenario out of the drawer and began to implement it. The world is holding its breath. You have to see this. Lithuania acts preemptively and turns to Ukraine for help. The Kremlin grinds its teeth and throws more fuel on the fire. Drones are flying right over Europeans' heads. Minsk has said yes again. The escalation is spreading like a web. Why is Trump turning a blind eye to this, and will there finally be an awakening before Putin launches the first missiles? Let's watch. To learn the Ukrainian lesson before it's too late, the Lithuanian Minister of Defense is heading to Kyiv. The country's president, Gitanas Nausėda, acknowledged the sky over Lithuania. Though not full of holes, it is still an open book for low-flying drones. That's why Lithuanians are ready to adopt the experience of Ukrainians.
First of all, we need to pay attention to detection capabilities, because we still have to admit that our detection zone is weak when drones fly at low altitudes, that is, up to 300 meters. We have plans, and the Ministry of Defense has presented how they intend to acquire everything necessary, not only for effective detection, but also to counter these drones. The problem is that not all of these plans are being implemented right here and now. Anti-drone equipment is not lined up on store shelves, and you can't just buy everything at once.
Lithuanian special services are still investigating whose drone exactly exploded in the border area with Belarus. The sound of its flight was heard even in Minsk. The drone exploded over Lake Levisas. Experts do not rule out that it was a Ukrainian UAV that went off course and was supposed to attack the northwest of Russia. Every such emergency in the Baltics raises a wave of concern among the population. After all, analysts from various countries have long been predicting tiny incidents. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are easy targets for Putin.
This strategic maneuver was specifically designed to rattle the nerves of the NATO alliance, creating a sense of unease and testing the collective resolve of its member nations through provocative military posturing. And in such a scenario, it's very hard for me to imagine that NATO troops would make some kind of heroic breakthrough to protect someone there. At best, they would defend themselves.
The Russians are increasingly resorting to provocations against the Baltic states, especially Estonia. Military fighter jets spent a full 12 minutes in the airspace of a NATO member. A group of little green men demonstratively paraded in full gear. And 3 border guards in uniform crossed the border on foot near the Narva River.
There are more Russians here than Estonians. And they all speak Russian, especially in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Very soon they'll be crawling back to Russia on their knees. Well, the whole city is Russian.
Narva starts right here. The Russian Ivan could begin his campaign through NATO lands from here. The name of this small town, with a population of only about 50,000, appears in every report about the Kremlin's plans.
A threat. The risk of Russia encroaching on Estonian territory, and in fact on the territory of an EU and NATO country, is more than real. Moreover, I have been voicing this scenario for several years now. Because in reality, this is considered the Russian approach to waging hybrid war against the West. At the same time, it appeared to be some kind of localized territorial incursion, perhaps even intervention in several areas.
Literally just recently, accounts of the so-called Narva People's Republic became active in Estonia, spreading calls for separatism and memes. The These public pages were registered in February of last year, but only recently began to be filled with content en masse. Local authorities assure that the Russians are using their favorite method, blackmail and pressure.
The goal of such an operation, of course, is to cause confusion and create such an impression quite cheaply with minimal costs. As if there are people who would like, so to speak, to separate Narva. But that's simply not true. Such channels have been created before, including in other European countries. For example, in 2014, after the occupation of Crimea, such groups were created in Latvia, in the Latgale region.
The Baltic territories are essentially squeezed between two potential aggressors, and unfortunately it seems that the US is ready to compromise their sovereignty in favor of the interests of dictators. This is exactly how the meeting of Donald's special envoy with 3 openly pro-Russian Lithuanian politicians looks, which John Cole held before his visit to Minsk.
The looming and multifaceted threat to the collective security of both Europe and Lithuania will originate not only from the aggressive Russian regime, but also from the various puppet actors currently operating within Ukraine. This includes the authoritarian regime of Alexander Lukashenko, and potentially from the shifting policies of the Trump administration as well. For us, the most dangerous scenario imaginable would be if these geopolitical interests were not properly aligned, failing to align in the specific and concerning way that we currently see happening within the borders of Hungary. But yesterday's meeting with the fringe elements shows that these interests can align at the expense of our security, in fact. Just yesterday, during a formal meeting held with various Lithuanian fringe groups, the official representative for Donald Trump clearly demonstrated that he intends to rely heavily on them within Lithuania. This means he will depend on those specific individuals who actively pursue pro-Russian policies and who consistently serve Russian interests. The same thing is happening with Hungary. Both of them are supporters of Orban. So we really need to proceed forward from this specific perspective. And of course, only then will the process of strengthening begin.
In terms of the broader European component, which is to say specifically the European Union itself as a whole, it must provide a strong and effective counterbalance to these specific developments within the context of this current global situation.
Warnings about a possible Russian attack on the Baltic countries have been voiced for decades. But right now, despite the enormous losses and expenses from its aggression against Ukraine, the Kremlin is ready to strike, experts are convinced. And most importantly, politicians should treat every provocation as a potential attack. Otherwise, in reality, we will see the story of the boy who cried wolf.
Urgently near Lyman, Putin buried half of his army. The Ukrainian Armed Forces performed excellently. This is a moment of triumph for our side. Syrskyi keeps the Russian army in a constant state of panic. The enemy's audacious plans remained only on paper. The Russians are panicking, their so-called special military operation shames them, and Putin only deceives. Nervousness is growing among the Muscovites' ranks. Is the war really stumbling and rushing toward its end? More on this ahead.
With the arrival of spring, the occupying forces, as always, moved forward. But even pro-Kremlin military bloggers are now criticizing the colossal losses the Russian army is suffering in these countless and senseless assaults.
On March 19th, the commander of the 144th Motorized Rifle Division, Major General Dmitry Mikhailov, sent significant forces of his division into an attack on enemy positions. The outcome was tragic. It is reported that more than 80 pieces of motorized equipment were destroyed, including 3 tanks, 11 infantry fighting vehicles, and armored personnel carriers, 5 artillery units, 1 TOS, 1 Asonsepyok, and about 160 drones. Of course, if the operational situation allows for launching large-scale offensive operations, then this opportunity should be taken. But the key to all of this is whether the situation allows it. A commander must rationally weigh the risks and the possible outcome when making a decision, rather than spinning the roulette wheel and hoping for the best.
This concerns the Lyman direction, but also other sectors of the front. The situation is the same. Exhausting assaults do not yield the desired results and lead to colossal losses.
And Russian generals are simply repeating their usual mistakes. In other words, the same situation happens every year. Spring arrives. The ground has already dried out, the mud season is practically over, so it's possible to attack. But with what should they attack? Let's go attack with tanks and armored vehicles. It turns out there are drones in the air, but we attack with tanks.
The Ukrainian General Staff notes that the Russian army has set a new record for losses. In 4 days, from March 19th to 23rd, the occupiers lost 6,100 soldiers. The fact that the occupying forces have begun mass offensives was also confirmed by the commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Syrsky. At the start of spring, the Russian army is making every effort to break through the Ukrainian defenses.
The enemy tried to break through the defensive lines of our troops in several strategic directions at once. Fierce battles have unfolded along the entire line of contact. In total, the enemy carried out 619 assault actions over these 4 days. The main strike by the occupiers was concentrated on the Pokrovsk and Oleksandrivka directions, where the enemy carried out the highest number of attacks. In particular, on the Pokrovsk direction, the enemy attacked our troops' positions 163 times, and on the Oleksandrivka direction, 96 times.
Analysts from the American Institute for the Study of War believe that Russia's spring-summer campaign has already failed. The losses cannot be compared to the number of new recruits, and the Kremlin already has little equipment left.
Such a high level of losses is unacceptable given the current pace of recruitment in Russia and will likely reduce Russia's ability to conduct such large-scale assaults in the medium and long term.
Such heavy losses. At the moment, the Russian army can still afford them, and it's still too early to say that the occupiers' offensive has been thwarted. For now, the armed forces of Ukraine have achieved initial successes, and these need to be consolidated.
A specific attack has been repelled. That is, right now, a number of attacks in different directions have been repelled. But to say that the offensive has been stopped creates a misunderstanding of the current combat situation on the front line. So from this, it follows that if you say the entire offensive operation is underway, the Russian one, then that's it. It's completely thwarted. And now the Russian general is just sitting there scratching his head, wondering what to do next. Damn, it worked. For now, let's put things on pause, come up with a new direction for the attack, and strike there. No, nothing like that is happening. A specific attack was thwarted. According
to analysts, Russian forces are unlikely to capture the fortress belt in Donbas by 2026. Most likely, they will achieve only minor tactical successes, and even those will come at the cost of heavy losses. That is why, even now, the top officials of the Kremlin are preparing the population for the fact that there definitely won't be any major successes at the front this year.
Russian officials are already shaping expectations in the information space for slow progress and heavy losses. However, one of the deputies of the Russian State Duma stated on March 23rd that there are casualties in every war. But Russian troops will try to minimize losses as they slowly advance towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk.
The spring-summer campaign of 2026 has only just begun, and it is clear that the armed forces of Ukraine have had a successful start. Ukrainian forces are acting proactively and inflicting enormous losses on the enemy, but this is only the beginning of the campaign.
Shock: the secret deal between Donald Trump and Alexander Lukashenko. Sanctions are lifted, the dictator is flying to Washington. This provokes a sharp reaction in the Kremlin. The Minsk-Moscow alliance is now in question. The most high-profile moment has been chosen, one that is maximally painful for Putin. A serious shift in the balance of power is approaching. This is no longer just diplomacy, this is a game of rupture. Is Lukashenko really changing course, and what does this mean for the entire region? Next, the most sensational details.
Years under sanctions again for the Belarusian Ministry of Finance. Banks and potash enterprises can operate without American restrictions.
This is the result of Lukashenko's meeting with the American delegation the day before on March 19th.
Honestly, if there wasn't any war happening, then all of these constant conflicts and difficult problems wouldn't affect your life at all.
In response, the dictator agreed to pardon 250 political prisoners, but the American delegation traveled to Minsk not to resolve the fate of Lukashenko's captives at all. Donald Trump sent his people to try to sway Lukashenko to his side. It's not about the war in Ukraine, but about China.
For quite some time now, the People's Republic of China has been viewing Belarus as a kind of springboard for the future, for example, as a way for China to access European markets. There was even a period when, due to the sanctions policy against Russia, Belarus, it made quite a good profit from this trade and served as a bridge between Europe, in essence the European market, and the Russian market. And China also wanted to take advantage of this. Let me remind you that the People's Republic of China has invested a great deal in Belarus.
And it was precisely for this that Lukashenko received perks in the form of eased sanctions.
Restrictions will be lifted from the Belarusian Ministry of Finance, the Development Bank of Belarus, and Belinvest Bank. In addition, the Belarusian potash company and Belaruskali, which are the main producers of potash fertilizers, will be removed from the US sanctions list.
Officially, of course, neither side will acknowledge this. Publicly, the Americans say that they sincerely... Lukashenko's opinion on geopolitical issues is interesting.
In addition to that, we also discussed in great detail what his specific perspective is regarding the war in Iran and Belarus, what he thinks about the war in Iran and the United States, and exactly how this entire complex situation is developing at this very moment. It is always very valuable to get the opinion of your president, the president of Belarus, because it is a completely different perspective compared to what we can get in the West.
Yes, the opinion is different. Lukashenko says directly that the US is attacking his friends.
You are fighting against our friends, and I am ready to talk openly about this topic.
But even despite this, the father leader is good and understanding, so he forgave Trump even such mistakes.
I still, despite certain specific policy choices made by the United States as I personally see it, continue to remain a very firm supporter of your president.
In short, the visit from the Americans greatly pleased the Belarusian dictator's ego. But Yabatsky has yet another reason to be happy. He is being invited to Washington for meetings with Trump. According to experts, the Americans, of course, wanted to demonstrate their strength to Putin as well.
This is also a kind of signal to the Russian leadership that even in your so-called sphere of influence, we can play our own games with your satellites. They will still listen carefully to what we say and, in fact, to what we do, because we, the United States, and everyone with us wants to have good relations.
So the logical question is, how will Lukashenko's relationship with his powerful bunker ally develop after this? Especially considering that this is not the end of cooperation between the US and Belarus, since this also concerns in particular the restoration of the work of the American embassy in Belarus.
We have once again held quick consultations with the US State Department and other involved agencies. Work is ongoing in this direction. I can't give you any specific dates, but the work is underway.
But does this mean that Lukashenko is abandoning Putin? No. The cunning and mustachioed Colorado beetle will once again try to sit on two chairs at the same time.
This, for example, gives Lukashenko grounds to think that if something happens there, if Russia starts to pressure him from the perspective of direct involvement in the war against Ukraine, he can take advantage of support from the United States, and Russia will have to treat him differently. They will treat him a bit differently. So this is also from Lukashenko's side a certain game. That is, he is showing Moscow, you consider me your complete satellite, but I can once again sit on the fence.
The Institute for the Study of War is confident that the lifting of American sanctions against Belarus will directly benefit the Russian economy.
The Institute for the Study of War has long concluded that Russia has effectively annexed Belarus and that both countries share a unified defense industrial base. Therefore, the lifting of US sanctions against Belarus is directly beneficial to Russia's military efforts.
And one more important point. The lifting of American sanctions is good for Belarus, but the removal of European restrictions is much more important. And that will not happen, at least for now. Of course, the issue of security plays an important role. As long as Belarus remains so closely tied to Russia, it is a threat to Europe. But the US has, one way or another, given Lukashenko a chance.
This is also a hint, including to those in Belarus, don't do anything foolish, don't get involved in any wrongdoings. And if Lukashenko plays by the rules and doesn't stir up this hysteria about the Suwalki corridor and so on, then obviously, even if just a little, his image will improve. But for him, the main thing isn't even improving his image, you understand? The main thing isn't the perception of Belarus as Lukashenko's state in the world. For him, the most important thing is simply not to be mentioned too much, you see? And that he doesn't get caught up in any of those news stories. That's how he'll just sit there quietly, keeping a low profile. He's actually fine with everything being focused on Russia.
But will the Belarusian deputy justify the credit of trust? Time will tell.
This can no longer be hidden. Even Vladimir Putin is forced to acknowledge the obvious. The Russian economy is going downhill. What they covered up for years with loud statements has now come to the surface. The oil vein has been struck, and the Kremlin will no longer be able to heal it. Emergency measures to stay afloat are not helping. Poverty is engulfing the Russian Federation completely. The situation is much worse than what is officially shown. Don't miss the first shocking details coming up next.
Russia is finished.
Putin has openly admitted that the country's economy has collapsed.
The previously mentioned reduction in the overall gross domestic product represents the very first instance of such an economic downturn occurring since the year 2023, marking a significant shift in the financial trajectory that had been observed up until this particular point in time.
Yeah. Let us now take a much more thorough look at the comprehensive forecasts and various analytical projections that have been meticulously prepared for the upcoming period to see what lies ahead.
These current conditions are worsening at an increasingly rapid and alarming pace, and the daunting prospect of a further, more significant decline could potentially lead to a wide range of extremely serious social and economic consequences that would undoubtedly have a deep and lasting impact on the overall stability of the entire region for many years to come. If you claim that the entire economic situation is perfectly stable, but then quite suddenly and without any prior warning, yet very often several times a week, important high-level meetings are being convened in the Kremlin late at night, and they last a long time, which probably means something is wrong.
Previously, official sources in Russia had already recorded a sharp slowdown in economic growth. In 2025, it amounted to about 1%, which turned out to be much lower than the authorities had expected. The crisis affected most sectors. Out of 28 main sectors of the Russian economy, 21 ended the year in the red. Raw material extraction, the metallurgical industry, and the light industry all declined. In addition, for the first time in 15 years, food production has decreased.
Now, one indicator that people often like to talk about is that restaurants are starting to close in Moscow. Why are restaurants closing? Because the people who usually dine at restaurants, they no longer have enough money to dine at restaurants. Accordingly, they don't spend money in restaurants, so restaurants don't receive enough profit. And on top of that, there's also a tax increase. Let's not forget that in Russia, taxes were raised starting from January of this year. The value-added tax was raised from 20% to 22%. They increased fees, raised other payments, and reduced the number of beneficiaries.
For 2026, the Russian authorities initially forecasted economic growth of over 2%, but later revised it down to 1.3%.
It not only could be even lower, it could actually go negative, which is what people are saying now. Even this Confidence Center for Economic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting, which it would seem is like a brother to the Russian Minister of Defense with close ties to those in power, they say that a recession this year is more than just a real possibility. It's not +1 or +0.8. It's -0.1 or -0.3, but it will be a minus. So right now, in Russia, the question of whether there will be any growth at all this year is being seriously discussed.
The slowdown of the economy threatens the Russian budget with a shortfall in revenues not related to the oil and gas sector. Despite the tax reform, which includes raising VAT and taxes on small businesses, according to calculations by Russian experts, the treasury may fall short by 500 billion rubles in VAT and about 200 billion rubles in profit tax.
The first quarter of the current year isn't even over yet, and already in the Russian media space, the phrase is being heard about what needs to be done. Budget sequestration. What is budget sequestration? It's when they say that they can't afford the expenses they had planned, so they will have to cut these expenditures. But that's logical. And it often happens, for example, by October, when it's already clear that the year is ending and it's impossible to fulfill the budget that was adopted at the beginning of the year. And accordingly, some actions need to be taken. Here, we're hearing these statements in March.
A crisis in Russia could erupt at any moment because even now most Russian regions are reporting a lack of funds even for the top priority expenditure, paying contracts for servicemen who are going to war against Ukraine.
The budget that was adopted, essentially, at the end of December, well, again, just 3 months ago, it's not realistic. This was mentioned when it was being adopted. But at that time, the main thing was just to pass the budget. Now, they are admitting this lack of realism. The decision by the mayor of Moscow to lay off 15% of employees, the statement that the Committee of Ministers will cut budget expenditures by 10%, these are no longer just words, these are real actions. And so, against the backdrop of these actions, to say that everything is great in the economy would be very foolish.
Economists note that Russia is facing a typical wartime crisis: rising military expenditures, a budget deficit, and increasing prices for fuel and food.
It is obvious that, even considering that in March there will be more oil and gas revenues, let's say expenditures, although that's not a given either, because as a rule, these are futures contracts. Prices have risen now, but what is coming in this month is the result of previous months. So, considering that the planned deficit for the year will be reached by the end of the first quarter.
Therefore, weak revenues, slowing economic growth, and high war expenditures will continue to put pressure on the country's finances.
That's all from me for now. This was me, Darina Hutskalo. Even more scorching news in our next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. See you soon.